In 1904, the Russian Empire covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. Its army numbered over 1.2 million men. Its navy ranked among the largest on the planet. Its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, believed war in the Far East was impossible. Not because Russia was peaceful, but because Japan was, in his words, incapable of serious resistance. On the night of the 8th of February 1904, that certainty collapsed. Japanese torpedo boats crossed the outer harbor of Port Arthur and struck the Russian Pacific Fleet at anchor. Battleships were crippled, crews were caught asleep, and Russia's most important Far Eastern base was thrown into chaos. No declaration of war had yet been delivered. 3 hours later, Japan formally announced hostilities. Diplomacy stalled, confidence blinded leadership. A surprise naval strike opened a Pacific War. Sounds familiar? What followed was not a colonial skirmish, but a full-scale industrial war, fought with steel battleships, mass conscription, machine guns, and rail logistics. When it ended, Russia would lose 2 fleets, suffer more than 130,000 dead, and slide toward revolution. Japan would emerge as a great power, and the world would realize that European dominance was no longer guaranteed. The Russo Japanese War was not triggered by a single crisis. It was the result of 2 expansionist empires moving into the same strategic space, and both believing that time favored them. For Russia, the Far East was not a frontier. It was an unfinished imperial project driven from the top down. Tsar Nicholas II, his ministers, and the Russian general staff were fixated on the Pacific for reasons that were structural, not ideological. Russia was a continental empire with a maritime handicap. Most of its ports froze in winter. Arkhangelsk iced over. Vladivostok was unusable for months each year. The Black Sea Fleet was trapped behind the Turkish Straits by international treaties. In any major war, Russia's navy risked being immobilized without ever being defeated. This vulnerability had already shaped Russian policy for centuries. From Peter the Great onward, Russian rulers pursued access to warm water ports as a condition of great power status. Control of the Baltic, pressure toward the Mediterranean, and later expansion into the Pacific were all expressions of the same strategic anxiety. Without year-round sea access, Russia could not protect trade, project power, or sustain a modern navy. By the 1890s, this logic focused sharply on East Asia. Port Arthur was ice-free, defensible, and positioned astride the Yellow Sea. For the first time, Russia could base a battle fleet in the Pacific that did not freeze in harbor. To Nicholas II and his admirals, losing that base would mean returning to strategic paralysis. A navy powerful on paper, but crippled by geography. This belief was reinforced by prestige and fear. Every other great power of the 19th century, Britain, France, Germany, anchored its status in overseas bases and global sea lanes, to the point that those once inferior powers became equals, if not superior, to the empire. Russian officers feared that without a permanent Pacific outlet, Russia would be treated not as a global empire, but as a second-tier continental power. In this sense, Port Arthur was not merely a harbor. It was Russia's claim to remain among the great powers. The problem was logistics. Supplying Vladivostok or Port Arthur meant moving men and materiel nearly 9,000 kilometers from European Russia, across Siberia, on a rail line that was still incomplete. A single battalion could take over a month to arrive. Artillery shells, horses, even basic food supplies frequently arrived late, damaged, or unusable. The solution was conceived by Sergei Witte, Russia's Minister of Finance, and embraced by the Tsar as a civilizational project: the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was not only meant to move troops, but to bind Asia to Russia permanently. To shorten the route and reduce vulnerability, Witte negotiated the construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway directly through Manchuria. Guarded by Russian troops, operated by Russian administrators, and built to Russian rail gauge. On paper, Manchuria remained Chinese. In practice, it became Russian. The railway's administrative center at Harbin was staffed almost entirely by Russians, protected by Russian soldiers, and governed under Russian law. Contemporary observers openly referred to it as the Moscow of the Orient. In 1898, this logic reached its climax. With the Tsar's approval, Russia secured a lease of Port Arthur, transforming it into its first true warm-water naval base in the Pacific. Engineers fortified the harbor, the Navy anchored its Pacific Fleet there, and the General Staff planned around it as a permanent stronghold. To Russian planners, men trained in continental warfare and imperial expansion. To Japan, it was a tightening noose. Japan's response to Russian expansion was shaped by a revolution that had already overturned its own society. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration dismantled the Tokugawa shogunate, ending more than 2 centuries of feudal rule. Power was formally restored to the emperor, Meiji, then only 15 years old. But real authority rested with a small group of oligarchs drawn from the former samurai elite of Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen. These men had reached a shared conclusion. Japan would modernize completely, or it would be colonized. Their fear was not theoretical. In 1839 up till 1858, China had been cracked open like a chestnut with absolutely no chance at retaliation, and had been drowned under the opium for the decades to come. Western gunboats had forced open Japan itself through its ports in the 1850s. Emperor Meiji absorbed this lesson early. In the Charter Oath of 1868, issued in his name, he declared that knowledge shall be sought throughout the world, so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. It was not a call for imitation, but for survival. Choice was then made to pursue modernization at a speed never seen thus far, even from any Western country. In less than 50 years, Japan went from the Middle Ages to modernity. Feudal domains were abolished and replaced by a centralized state. Samurai stipends were eliminated, hereditary privilege dismantled, and a national conscription system introduced in 1873, forcing peasants and former warriors alike into uniform that were now wielding rifles instead of katanas. The army was reorganized along Prussian lines, with German advisors training officers and shaping doctrine. Railways, telegraph lines, and modern ports spread across the islands. By the 1890s, Japan possessed an industrial base capable of producing artillery, ammunition, and warships. Education itself became a weapon. A national school system indoctrinated loyalty to the emperor, discipline, and sacrifice. Bushido, once the ethic of a warrior caste, was repurposed as a mass ideology, teaching obedience, endurance, and honor to an entire population. By the turn of the century, Japanese schoolchildren were being trained to see military service as civic duty and death in war as meaningful. A set of beliefs that would be even more useful in the coming conflicts. But the real regime's pride would become its navy, modeled on the Royal Navy, commanded by officers trained in Britain and supplied by modern shipyards. Japan's fleet emphasized gunnery accuracy, centralized command, and initiative, and Japan on several occasions tested out its efficiency. Victory over China in 1895 validated this approach, but the forced concessions of the Triple Intervention convinced Japanese leaders that military strength alone was insufficient. Recognition by Western powers would come only when Japan could not be ignored, or worse, looked down upon anymore. Emperor Meiji himself embodied this paradox. He adopted Western dress, technology, and institutions, but rejected Western cultural submission. Japan would modernize, not westernize. In this sense, we often think Japan adopted the Western traits during its modernization, when really, everything at the head of the pyramid remained very Japanese. The emperor as still the sacred axis of the state, while Western science and organization became tools in his service. In Meiji's view, shared by his advisors, civilization was measured by power, not by race. By 1904, Japan had transformed itself from an isolationist feudal archipelago into a centralized industrial war state in less than 40 years. It did not seek war with Russia out of ambition alone. It sought it because every lesson of the Meiji era had taught Japan that hesitation invited extinction. There was a real sense of necessity in those rapid initiatives, because Japan's confidence was forged not through its victories, but through what it felt like humiliation. During the Perry expeditions between 1852 to 1854, Japan itself had faced the gap of military power and was forced to grant foreign powers access to its port to trade. And again, in 1895, after defeating China, it would be forced by Russia, Germany, and France to surrender its gains in the Triple Intervention. The message was unmistakable. Battlefield success meant nothing without European approval. From that moment, Japanese leaders concluded that survival required expansion, and that Korea was non-negotiable. Strategically, the peninsula was a loaded pistol aimed at the Japanese home islands. Politically, No major figure in Tokyo accepted the idea that Korea had a right to remain independent. Russia disagreed. It didn't look at the coming of an expansionist empire right to its frontier with a favorable eye. After the assassination of Queen Min by Japanese agents in 1895, and the flight of King Gojong to the Russian legation in Seoul, Russian influence in Korea surged. Russian mining and forestry concessions appeared along the Yalu River. Russian troops flooded Manchuria after the Boxer Rebellion, rising to over 100,000 men, despite repeated assurances that they would withdraw. Tsar Nicholas II dismissed Japanese objections. In private correspondence, he referred to the Japanese as yellow monkeys, and assumed they would yield once confronted with Russia's superior numbers, which is a tactic Russia was used to, thanks to having a very loose appreciation of its soldiers and overall population's life. In 1901, he declared, "I do not want to seize Korea, but under no circumstances can I allow Japan to become firmly established there." Japan, unsure of its forces and of what the outcome would be, faced with a Western power still, attempted compromise. Tokyo proposed recognizing Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of Korea as Japan's sphere of influence. Russia delayed, countered, and continued strengthening its position, convinced Japan would not dare fight a European empire. German Kaiser Wilhelm II reinforced this belief, warning Nicholas of a racialized yellow peril, and assuring him that Germany would support Russia if war came. Nicholas believed him. Japanese leaders did not. By late 1903, Tokyo concluded that diplomacy was no longer negotiation. It was cover for Russian reinforcement. As Japanese Foreign Minister Komura Jutaro warned, the negotiations have now been pending for no less than 4 months. The delays themselves have become a danger. On the 6th of February 1904, Japan severed diplomatic relations. 2 days later, its fleet was already underway. The war did not begin because diplomacy failed. It began because Japan decided that waiting would be fatal. And in a sense, maybe it would have been. Japan did not declare war expecting Russia to collapse immediately. It declared war to seize the initiative, before Russia's size could matter. The opening phase of the conflict was built around a single unforgiving calculation. Japan could win quickly, or it could not win at all. The first objective was naval. Port Arthur was the keystone of Russian power in the Far East. It housed the 1st Pacific Squadron, Russia's only modern fleet in the region, and protected the sea lanes that any Japanese army would need to cross to reach the Asian mainland. As long as the Russian fleet remained operational, Japan's entire war plan was at risk. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, commander of the combined fleet, understood this. Educated in Britain and shaped by Royal Navy doctrine, Togo rejected the idea of a formal line of battle opening. Instead, he opted for shock, disruption, and psychological dominance. So, on the night of 8th February 1904, Japanese destroyers launched a surprise torpedo attack against the Russian fleet at anchor. The assault was tactically limited but strategically decisive. The battleships Cesarevich and Redvizan were heavily damaged. The cruiser Pallada was crippled. Russian sailors were killed in their bunks. Command cohesion collapsed. The following morning, Togo brought his main fleet forward, daring the Russians to sortie. They did not. Russian Admiral Stepan Makarov, one of the Navy's few aggressive and competent commanders, attempted to restore initiative. But on the 13th of April, his flagship Petropavlovsk struck a Japanese mine and sank within minutes. Makarov was killed instantly. With him died the last serious chance for Russian naval initiative in the opening phase of the war. The fleet retreated into Port Arthur, where it would remain largely passive, blockaded, shelled, and slowly destroyed. This naval paralysis allowed Japan to move to its second objective, Korea. Japanese planners viewed Korea not as a secondary theater, but as a strategic corridor. Control of the peninsula meant secure supply lines, protected ports, and a direct land route into Manchuria. Speed mattered. Delay invited Russian reinforcement. Within days of the naval attack, Japanese troops landed at Incheon, occupied Seoul, and imposed control over the Korean government with minimal resistance. And Russia, unwilling to provoke escalation before it was ready, did not intervene. By late April 1904, Japanese forces were massing near the Yalu River, the boundary between Korea and Manchuria. Across the river stood Russian troops under General Mikhail Zasulich, poorly deployed, spread thin, and convinced the Japanese forces lacked the strength to cross in force. This assumption reflected a deeper Russian error, the deadly sin of pride. Russian intelligence consistently underestimated Japanese manpower, training, and operational coordination. War plans assumed Japan could mobilize no more than 400,000 men, with only 150,000 to 170,000 available for frontline operations. The idea that Japan could sustain offensive action deep into Manchuria was dismissed. May 1, 1904, showed them they were wrong. Japanese forces under General Kuroki Tamemoto launched their first major land offensive of the war at the Yalu River. Russian troops, commanded by General Mikhail Zasulich, occupied a defensive line along the northern bank. Confident that the river itself was a sufficient obstacle, Zasulich deployed his forces thinly and failed to fortify in depth. Russian artillery positions were poorly concealed, and reconnaissance was minimal. The Japanese exploited this complacency. For days, Japanese engineers constructed pontoon bridges and fords under cover of night, while diversionary movements fixed Russian attention on the center. At dawn, Japanese artillery opened fire, accurately targeting exposed Russian gun positions. Infantry divisions then crossed at multiple points, including sectors the Russians believed impassable. Once across, Japanese troops executed coordinated flanking maneuvers, rolling up Russian positions from the side rather than assaulting them frontally. Russian units, unable to redeploy quickly and receiving confused orders, began to fall back. By the end of the day, Zasulich ordered a general retreat. The defeat was limited in scale but decisive in effect. It was the first major land battle of the war, and it ended any remaining Russian belief that Japanese forces were tactically inferior. Russian commanders now understood that Japan could plan, coordinate, and execute modern combined arms operations on equal and sometimes superior terms. The psychological impact was immediate. Expectations of a short war and easy victory turned to ashes. The initiative passed permanently to Japan. And from this point forward, Russian strategy shifted from offense to delay, buying time for reinforcements that would arrive too slowly to restore the balance. Japan had achieved exactly what it needed: naval freedom of movement, control of Korea, and proof, to itself and to the world, that Russia could be beaten. But the war was only beginning, and every kilometer Japan advanced now pushed it closer to the limits of its own strength. Once Korea was secured, Japan turned back to the problem it left behind: the sea. As Admiral Togo Heihachiro made clear to his officers, the fate of the empire depends on this battle. Port Arthur was not simply a base. It was the last obstacle between Japan and uncontested control of the Yellow Sea. The Russian Pacific Fleet was still there, neutralized but not destroyed. As long as Port Arthur remained in Russian hands, Japanese troop movements to the mainland were exposed to risk. Japan could not afford uncertainty. Port Arthur sat at the southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, surrounded by steep hills dominating the harbor. Russian engineers had spent years fortifying these heights with concrete redoubts, trench systems, barbed wire, and overlapping artillery fields. It was one of the strongest fortress systems ever constructed outside Europe. The garrison, commanded by General Anatoly Stessel, numbered tens of thousands. Behind it lay the harbor, crowded with the ships of the 1st Pacific Squadron, intact, immobilized, and increasingly irrelevant. In April 1904, Japan landed the Third Army on the Liaodong Peninsula and severed Port Arthur from the north. The Third Army was not Japan's most experienced field formation. It was assembled specifically for the Port Arthur operation and included a high proportion of recently mobilized conscripts, many of whom had completed only the minimum required training. Its role was not maneuver warfare, but siege and assault, tasks that demanded endurance more than flexibility. Its commander, General Nogi Marisuke, embodied the contradictions of the Meiji officer corps. Nogi was personally austere, deeply loyal to the emperor, and shaped by an older samurai ethos that emphasized duty, obedience, and personal responsibility for loss. Earlier in his career, he had suffered professional disgrace after losing regimental colors during the Satsuma Rebellion, an experience that left him intensely sensitive to failure and determined never to retreat from assigned objectives. This background shaped his conduct at Port Arthur. Nogi believed that determination and speed could offset material disadvantages. He accepted heavy casualties as the price of mission accomplishment and pressed forward with assaults even when results were minimal. In his thinking, prolonged hesitation risked strategic failure and dishonor, both personally and nationally. These assumptions would be tested brutally against modern fortifications. The Third Army would fight with discipline and resolve, but it would pay for every meter of ground with blood. Beginning in August, Nogi ordered repeated frontal assaults against the outer defensive ring. Japanese infantry advanced across open ground into entrenched Russian machine guns and artillery. The attacks gained little ground and inflicted enormous casualties. Entire battalions were shattered. Nogi later acknowledged that these assaults had been carried out at a cost no victory could justify. By autumn, the approach changed. Japan brought forward 280mm siege howitzers, massive guns originally designed for coastal defense. Transporting and emplacing them was slow and costly. But once in position, they transformed the siege. The objective became the high ground overlooking the harbor, positions from which artillery observers could direct fire onto the fleet itself. In December 1904, after weeks of bombardment and underground mining operations, Japanese troops captured these key hills. Using telephone-linked observers, artillery fire was adjusted directly onto Russian ships anchored below. Battleships and cruisers were struck repeatedly. One by one, they were sunk or rendered useless. The remaining vessels were eventually scuttled by their own crews. A modern fleet had been destroyed almost entirely by land-based artillery. Inside the fortress, the situation collapsed. Supplies were exhausted, casualties mounted. Port Arthur was still there, under Russian control, but with the fleet gone, it no longer served a strategic purpose. Stessel later justified his decision simply: the purpose of defense had been lost. On the 2nd of January 1905, without authorization from the Tsar and without consulting his staff, he surrendered the fortress. Stessel would later be court-martialed, convicted, and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted. Japan's victory came at a severe price. The siege had cost tens of thousands of casualties, many from the early failed assaults. General Nogi Marisuke, consumed by responsibility for the losses, later requested permission to commit ritual suicide. And in the 19th century Japan, such a request was not for show. Emperor Meiji refused. His response was unambiguous: you must live and serve. Strategically, Port Arthur's fall was decisive. Russia lost its only warm-water naval base in the Pacific. Its Far Eastern fleet ceased to exist, and the war's center of gravity shifted inland, toward Manchuria. The next battles would be decided not by fortresses or fleets, but by mass armies. By early 1905, Japan had achieved the objectives that had brought it to war. The Russian naval threat in East Asia had been neutralized. Port Arthur, Russia's main Pacific stronghold, had fallen. Korea was firmly under Japanese control. Measured purely in military terms, Japan could claim success. But Japan's leaders understood something that battlefield maps did not show. Victory meant nothing unless it could be secured diplomatically. The memory of 1895 loomed over every decision. That experience had taught Tokyo a harsh lesson. Wars were not decided by who won battles, but by who controlled the terms of peace. And 1905 was a very similar situation from where Japan stood. Russia had lost a fleet and a fortress, but it had not admitted defeat. Its main army remained intact in Manchuria, growing steadily as reinforcements arrived along the Trans-Siberian Railway. As long as that army stood, Russia could argue that the war's outcome was unresolved, that losses at sea had been balanced by endurance on land, and Russia is used to endurance wars. This mattered because Russia was not isolated. Its interests were bound to other European countries, especially France, which was not a neutral observer. Before Russia entered war in 1904, nearly half of its government debt was held abroad, and Paris was its single most important creditor. At the very outbreak of the war, Russia secured a 350 million ruble loan in Paris at 5% interest. A sum, which adjusted for inflation, is approximately equivalent to $6.5 billion in today's money. It was a level of financial confidence that Japan itself could not yet command. And as the war continued, French banks went further. Over the course of the conflict, they extended approximately 800 million francs to sustain Russia's war effort, so another modern equivalent of $5.5 billion. They financed mobilization, transport, artillery, and endurance. So for France, a decisive Russian defeat in Asia was not merely a diplomatic setback. It threatened over $12 billion worth of exposure in modern terms, the stability of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the balance of power in Europe itself. Preserving Russian credibility, even after military losses, was therefore a financial imperative as much as a strategic one. Germany's role was different but no less consequential. Berlin had repeatedly encouraged Russian firmness before the war, assuring Tsar Nicholas II that Germany would cover Russia's back in Europe. This encouragement was not intended to secure a Russian victory in Asia, but to keep Russia entangled far from the continent, weakening the Franco-Russian partnership and increasing German leverage at home, which, a decade before World War I, was especially important. Together, this meant that a negotiated settlement preserving Russian dignity was far more attractive to Paris and Berlin than a decisive Japanese victory. And Japan understood that perfectly. Calls for mediation, pressure for moderation, a reasonable compromise imposed in the name of stability. If Japan paused now, Russia could enter negotiations portraying itself as temporarily set back, not defeated. European powers could then justify intervention on the grounds that the war had reached a stalemate. And once again, Japan's battlefield victories could be revised at the conference table. Japanese leaders were determined not to allow that to happen. Again, the only way to prevent external intervention was not to oppose it diplomatically, but to make diplomacy irrelevant overall. As long as Russia retained a viable army in Manchuria, mediation remained possible. Only a clear and unmistakable defeat would strip Russia and its allies of ennui leverage. There was also a hard financial reality. Japan's war effort depended heavily on foreign loans from London and New York. These loans were not secured by promises or goodwill, but by victory. Every major Japanese success strengthened confidence in Tokyo's ability to win, and therefore to repay. A halt in operations without a decisive outcome risked undermining that confidence at the very moment Japan was approaching the limits of its resources. Momentum, therefore, was not optional. Japan also continued to fight because it was already negotiating, not for peace, but for the post-war order. Even before Port Arthur fell, Tokyo had begun shaping its demands. Formal recognition of Japanese supremacy in Korea, the transfer of Russia's leasehold rights in the Liaodong Peninsula, control over strategic railways in southern Manchuria, and the removal of Russian military power from the region altogether. None of this could be obtained while the Russian army remained undefeated. This is why Japan did not stop after Port Arthur. It did not seek war for conquest alone, nor out of blind ambition. It continued because half victory was the most dangerous outcome imaginable, one that invited foreign revision, financial collapse, and diplomatic humiliation. Manchuria therefore became the final theater of decision, not because Japan desired it, but because the logic of great power politics left no alternative. The war would no longer be decided by fleets or fortresses. It would be decided by mass armies, and by whether Japan could impose a result so decisive that no Western power could plausibly dispute it. Anything less risked repeating the past. So despite being on a winning trend, Japan felt the weight of diplomacy and finances closing in, and its potential next moves were shrinking rapidly. The Russian army in Manchuria had to be broken. That reckoning came at Mukden. Because Russia did not wait for Japan to come and attack them in Manchuria, by early 1905, it had transformed the region into one of the most heavily militarized on Earth. Russian forces under General Alexei Kuropatkin had concentrated along a broad defensive front south of Mukden, anchored on rail lines and fortified villages. Months of reinforcement had pushed Russian strength in the region to over 300,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, a force Japan could not match. Field Marshal Oyama Iwao, commander of Japanese forces in Manchuria, had roughly 250,000 troops at his disposal. But many were exhausted, undersupplied, and operating at the end of extended supply lines. Ammunition stocks were tight, replacement drafts were thin. Japan knew this would likely be its last opportunity to force a decision. The Battle of Mukden began in February 1905 and quickly expanded into one of the largest land battles the world had ever seen. Oyama avoided a direct frontal assault. Instead, Japanese forces applied pressure across the entire Russian line, while preparing a wide envelopment aimed at Kuropatkin's flanks. The intent was not immediate breakthrough, but cumulative collapse, forcing the Russians to respond everywhere at once, stretching command and control beyond its limits. Kuropatkin, true to form, hesitated. Russian units fought stubbornly, and in several sectors successfully repelled Japanese attacks. Tactically, the Russian army was not collapsing. The problem was positional and operational, not moral. But Oyama's plan unfolded gradually. Japanese armies advanced on both flanks, particularly to the west, extending the battlefield far beyond Kuropatkin's original defensive frontage. Each advance forced the Russians to lengthen their line, thin their reserves, and commit units meant for counterattack simply to hold ground. Kuropatkin's reserves, his decisive asset, became immobilized by uncertainty. Russian intelligence repeatedly reported Japanese movements on the flanks, but could not determine their scale. Fearing a full encirclement, Kuropatkin withheld his central reserves to guard against a breakthrough that might cut the Mukden-Harbin railway, the army's primary supply and retreat line. As the battle dragged on, this caution became paralysis. Japanese forces did not deliver a single dramatic blow. Instead, they advanced incrementally, threatening Russian communications rather than smashing the front. When Japanese units reached positions that endangered the rail line north of Mukden, Kuropatkin faced a binary choice: counterattack with exhausted and scattered forces, or withdraw before his army was cut off. By early March 1905, the situation was no longer tactical, it was logistical. If the rail line was severed, the Russian army risked partial encirclement, supply collapse, and disintegration in retreat. On 10th March, Kuropatkin ordered a general withdrawal to preserve the army. The retreat was not ordered because the Russians had been defeated in place. It was ordered because the battlefield geometry had turned against them. Mukden was abandoned not in panic, but in fear of something worse. And once the retreat began, the strategic verdict was unavoidable. Russia had surrendered the initiative, the ground, and the last chance to impose its will on the war. Additionally, the retreat was costly. Russian forces suffered massive casualties, tens of thousands killed, wounded, or captured, and enormous losses in equipment. Japanese casualties were also severe, underscoring the limits of Japan's endurance. But strategically, the outcome was unmistakable. Mukden was not merely a defeat, it was proof that Russia could not regain the initiative. For Japan, the battle achieved what Port Arthur could not. It demonstrated to the world that Russia's main army had been beaten in open battle. The justification for mediation on equal terms collapsed. The argument that the war's outcome was undecided no longer held. Within weeks, the diplomatic atmosphere shifted. Russia's allies grew more cautious. Financial confidence wavered. Inside Russia itself, unrest spread as news of defeat combined with economic strain and political discontent. Mukden did not end the war immediately, but it ended the illusion that Russia could still win it. And with that illusion gone, the final act, at sea and at the negotiating table, was already taking shape. Mukden decided the land war, but it did not end the conflict. Because despite all these losses, one final option remained for Russia: the Navy. After the destruction of the Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, Tsar Nicholas II approved a desperate and unprecedented gamble. Russia would send its Second Pacific Squadron, drawn largely from the Baltic Fleet, halfway around the world to reassert naval power in East Asia. The decision was political as much as military. Without a visible victory, Russia risked diplomatic humiliation, financial collapse, and internal unrest. A successful fleet action, or even the mere arrival of a powerful naval force at Vladivostok, could restore leverage at the negotiating table. Command was given to Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. Rozhestvensky was an experienced administrator, but had never commanded a fleet in battle. His force was assembled hastily and unevenly. It included 11 battleships, several armored cruisers, and numerous auxiliaries. But many vessels were obsolete, poorly maintained, and crewed by sailors with minimal training. Gunnery practice had been limited. Coordination between squadrons was weak. The voyage itself revealed the fleet's condition. From October 1904, the squadron traveled over 18,000 nautical miles, coaling at sea and relying on neutral ports under strict diplomatic constraints. Mechanical failures were constant. Discipline deteriorated. Nervous crews mistook civilian vessels for enemy torpedo boats, culminating in the Dogger Bank incident, where Russian ships fired on British fishing trawlers, killing several fishermen and nearly provoking war with Britain. By the time the fleet reached Asian waters in May 1905, it was exhausted. Hull fouling had reduced speed. Coal quality was poor. Crews were fatigued and demoralized. Rozhestvensky's plan was simple: avoid battle if possible, pass through the Tsushima Strait, and reach Vladivostok intact. That's the exact Japan had anticipated. Admiral Togo Heihachiro had positioned scouting cruisers along the likely routes. Japanese wireless stations monitored Russian movements, and patrol lines were established across the Tsushima Strait, the shortest and most practical route north. On the morning of 27 May 1905, Japanese scouts sighted the Russian fleet entering the strait. Togo immediately concentrated his forces. The Japanese combined fleet consisted of 4 modern battleships, numerous armored cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats. Crucially, Japanese ships were faster, better maintained, and crewed by sailors who had spent months conducting live-fire gunnery exercises. Fire control procedures were centralized, and commanders had trained extensively in fleet maneuvers. As contact was made, Togo executed a deliberate maneuver to gain positional advantage. He turned his fleet across the head of the Russian formation, a classic crossing of the T, allowing Japanese ships to bring their full broadsides to bear, while the Russians could reply only with their forward guns. Japanese fire concentrated on the leading Russian battleships, disrupting command and formation almost immediately. Russian gunnery was slow and inaccurate. Japanese shells filled with shimose explosive, based on picric acid, designed to detonate violently on impact rather than after penetration. At Tsushima, these shells ignited massive fires and shattered ship interiors, crippling Russian vessels' crews and command long before they actually sank. Smoke and confusion spread down the line. Within the first hour, several Russian capital ships were heavily damaged, and fleet cohesion began to unravel. Rozhestvensky himself was wounded early in the battle, further degrading command. As daylight faded, the Russian formation disintegrated into scattered groups attempting to flee northward. During the night, Japanese destroyers and torpedo boats launched repeated attacks, exploiting the Russian fleet's lack of coordination and poor night fighting capability. By the morning of 28 May, the outcome was beyond doubt. Russian battleships were sunk, captured, or scuttled. Crews surrendered or abandoned ship. Only a handful of vessels managed to escape toward Vladivostok. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the Tsushima Strait, over 20 were sunk, and most of the remainder were captured or interned. Thousands of Russian sailors were killed or taken prisoner. Japanese losses were minimal by comparison. The battle annihilated Russia's last operational fleet. Tsushima was not simply a tactical defeat. It destroyed Russia's final means of projecting power in the Far East, eliminated any remaining argument that the war's outcome was undecided, and exposed the full cost of imperial miscalculation. Within days, financial markets reacted. Confidence in Russian recovery collapsed. Within weeks, unrest inside Russia escalated toward revolution. Tsushima did what Port Arthur and Mukden together could not. It made continuation impossible. And for the first time, Russia was forced to confront a reality it had tried to avoid since the war began. The empire had been decisively beaten, not by chance, but by a modern state it had fatally underestimated. By the summer of 1905, the Russo Japanese War was no longer being decided by armies or fleets. It was being decided by diplomacy under constraint. After Tsushima, Russia's ability to continue the war collapsed in military terms, but its diplomatic position did not vanish overnight. The Russian army in Manchuria still existed. The empire still possessed European allies, and crucially, Russia still mattered to the international financial system. But this time, Tokyo entered negotiations knowing it had won the war. The objective at Portsmouth was therefore not compromise, but recognition. Recognition of Japan's gains, and recognition of Japan as an equal great power. Russia's objective was simpler: avoid humiliation. Tsar Nicholas II authorized negotiations only after internal unrest, military defeat, and financial pressure converged. But his instructions to the Russian delegation were explicit: concede territory if necessary, recognize Japan's position in Korea if unavoidable, but pay no indemnity, and accept no language that implied total defeat. Russia's leverage lay not in strength, but in endurance. French financial backing remained critical. Russian negotiators knew that France would quietly oppose any settlement that openly shattered Russian credit or prestige. Germany, meanwhile, had little interest in seeing Japan emerge too dominant in East Asia. Neither power pushed for continued war, but neither supported Japanese maximalism. The talks opened in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, under the mediation of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's role was active, not neutral. He sought a balance that would check Russian expansion without allowing Japan to dominate the Pacific unchecked. His goal was stability. The issue was to limit all stakeholders. Russian negotiators refused categorically. They argued that Russia had not been invaded, that its army remained intact, and that no precedent required a defeated power to pay when no capital had fallen and no core territory had been occupied. This deadlock became the core crisis of Portsmouth. Japan faced an impossible choice. It could press its demands and risk the collapse of negotiations, a collapse that, despite all its victories, could not really afford, militarily or financially. Or it could accept a settlement that secured its strategic goals, but denied the public symbol of victory that indemnity represented. Tokyo chose security over symbolism. Under mounting pressure from Roosevelt, and with full awareness that Japan could not resume large-scale operations, the Japanese delegation abandoned the indemnity demand. In exchange, Russia recognized Japan's position in Korea, transferred Port Arthur and the southern half of Sakhalin, and withdrew from southern Manchuria. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, ended the war. Diplomatically, it was a compromise. Strategically, it was a victory. Psychologically, it was explosive. For Russia, defeat in the Far East forced a strategic reorientation, one that proved both necessary but also insufficient. After the war, the empire turned its attention decisively westward. The humiliation in Manchuria convinced Russian planners that the Far East could not be secured without first stabilizing Europe. Military reform accelerated. Rail construction shifted toward Poland and Ukraine. Strategic planning refocused on the Balkans and Central Europe, where prestige might be recovered and alliances mattered more. But the reorientation came too late, and it was incomplete. The war had already weakened the state at its core. The revolution of 1905, triggered and accelerated by military defeat, left the Tsarist system fundamentally compromised. Nicholas II retained his throne, but only by concession. The creation of the Duma did not stabilize the regime. It exposed its fragility. This weakness did not go unnoticed. France, Russia's principal ally, remained financially committed, but politically cautious. The instability revealed in 1905 raised doubts about Russia's reliability as a military partner. The Franco-Russian alliance endured, but its credibility was shaken. Germany was watching closely. Berlin interpreted Russia's defeat and internal unrest as evidence that the empire could be contained, perhaps even defeated, in a continental war. The assumption that Russia would require years to recover fed German confidence in the Schlieffen Plan, the belief that a two-front war could be managed if France were defeated quickly. This miscalculation would shape 1914. When war came, Russia entered it with unresolved problems first revealed in 1905: logistical weakness, brittle command structures, and a political system incapable of absorbing military failure. As defeats mounted, loyalty eroded. The same dynamics that had shaken the empire after Tsushima now operated on a far larger scale. In 1917, the Tsarist regime collapsed. Nicholas II was overthrown, imprisoned, and later executed with his family. Not as a fallen monarch, but as a symbol of a system that had lost all legitimacy. Quietly shot in the head in a basement of some house. The defeat of 1905 did not cause the revolution alone, but it marked the moment when the illusion of permanence was broken. From that collapse emerged something new. The Bolshevik Revolution replaced Imperial Russia with a radically different state. Within 2 decades, the Soviet Union would become the second axis of global power, reshaping the 20th century. The roots of that transformation ran directly through the crisis of authority, first exposed by defeat at the hands of Japan. Russia never took its full revenge. Consumed by European war, revolution, civil conflict, and reconstruction, it never returned to East Asia in strength. When the Soviet Union finally stabilized and defeated Nazi Germany in 1945, the strategic moment had passed. Japan had already been destroyed by another power. For Japan, victory produced momentum, but also a great deal of distortion. The war validated the Meiji project completely. Modernization, centralization, and industrial war had worked. Nationalist discourse hardened around a simple conclusion: strength ensured survival, and survival justified expansion. Education, propaganda, and ideology reinforced the belief that Japan's path was both necessary and righteous. The military emerged as the principal beneficiary. In 1905, force had delivered recognition where diplomacy had failed. From that point forward, Japanese strategy increasingly rejected partial victories. Decisive blows, overwhelming action, and fates accomplis became preferred tools. Civilian oversight weakened as military leaders gained confidence and autonomy. Asia offered no counterweight. China had been hand-dried by colonialist powers and could no longer contain Japanese ambitions on land. This absence of restraint encouraged risk-taking and encouraged the belief that Western powers, too, could be shocked into submission. The Russo Japanese War became a template. The opening attack on Port Arthur, surprise, speed, naval dominance, was studied, internalized, and mythologized. Decades later, the logic would reappear almost unchanged. The parallel to Pearl Harbor is astonishingly obvious. During World War I, allied with Britain, Japan exploited European distraction to consolidate its position in China. The 21 Demands of 1915 extended Japanese influence across Chinese territory and institutions, laying the groundwork for deeper involvement. Economic necessity followed ideology. Japan lacked natural resources. Industrial growth increased dependence on imported oil, coal, and raw materials. Expansion became framed not as choice but as survival. In 1931, the Manchurian incident marked the transition from influence to occupation, a direct continuation of the Manchurian logic first established in 1905. But the balance was changing. In 1939, at Khalkhin Gol, Japanese and Soviet forces clashed again on the Asian mainland. This time, the Soviet Union prevailed decisively. The lesson was clear. The old enemy had returned in a new form, stronger, mechanized, and unforgiving. Japan adjusted direction but not strategy. Unable to dominate the north, it turned south. In 1941, seeking resources and strategic depth, Japan struck into Southeast Asia and against the United States. The belief that decisive force could compel political outcomes, born at Port Arthur and confirmed at Tsushima, now drove global war. Japan followed that logic to its limit. What Japan misunderstood was the scale. It gravely underestimated the United States' industrial capacity, political resilience, and willingness to fight a prolonged war. The assumption that a decisive opening strike could force negotiation, validated in 1905, would prove catastrophic by 1941. And by 1945, it reached the end of the road, completely worn out on all sides. The Russo Japanese War did not simply reshape borders, it set trajectories. For Russia, it cracked an empire that would collapse 12 years later, giving rise to a new ideological power. That would shape the century to come. For Japan, it validated expansion through force, a belief that carried it from Port Arthur to Pearl Harbor, and finally, to ruin. Neither country ever escaped the War of 1904. They lived inside its consequences for the rest of the century.